ये है कि पैशन को प्रोफेशन बना लो तो हर दिन संडे ही लगता है।
केमिया था।
मॉम, मेरा कैलकुलेटर कहाँ है?
मुझे नहीं पता।
तुम ठीक तो हो ना बेटा? लगते रहे हो। बहुत कम नहीं ना?
इस जगह को देखकर कोई नहीं कह सकता, पर ये वही सड़क है जो न्यूयॉर्क वाली।
कहाँ गएगा?
इस बंदे से चिढ़ मचती है। जल्दी बाहर निकलिए मैम।
निकलना तो
बैंक में क्या था?
हाय, 30 to 50 ब्राइटन बीच यही है।
और 10 मिस्टीरियो तुम्हारी।
हाँ, पता है, मैंने देखा है, इतना वायरल है, कैसे नहीं दिखता। पर सच ये कि मेरा कोई नहीं है, ना मैं किसी से मिलता रहता।
ना घर है, ना प्यार है, ना यार है, तभी दुखी आत्मा लगते हो। दुनिया भर की एजेंसीज के साइबर सेल ने सिक्योरिटी को अलर्ट कर दिया है। किसी ने डैमेज कंट्रोल के रेस्ट्रिक्टेड सर्वर्स को एक्सेस किया था, वो भी उन्हीं के स्टेशन के 30 अलग-अलग एम्प्लॉयज की आईडी से। ये खड़े हो जाइए।
ये एक असाधारण इंसान है जो ताकतवर है, तेज और फुर्तीला, तीव्र इंद्रिया।
बात समझे या आगे बढ़ने की सीढ़ी?
बहुत ठीक था। वाह, कमाल की चीज है।
मैं तुमसे झूठ नहीं कहूँ, इस वक्त हम शिकार बने।
Peter Parker has spent years learning that being Spider-Man costs him pieces of an ordinary life. Brand New Day begins from a more unsettling possibility. What happens when there is almost no ordinary life left to protect? The world has forgotten Peter Parker, his closest relationships have continued without him, and the mask is no longer one responsibility among many. It has become the structure holding his entire existence together. Cinema Deep View looks at Spider-Man, Brand New Day not simply as another chapter in a superhero franchise, but as a test of whether total commitment can become a quieter form of disappearance. That tension gives the title an immediate double meaning. A brand new day usually suggests renewal, freedom, and a clean beginning. For Peter, however, starting again does not mean escaping the past. It means waking inside the consequences of a sacrifice that nobody else remembers. He can move through New York without the burden of public recognition, yet he also moves through a private world in which the people who once defined him no longer know the person beneath the suit. The freedom is real, but it is shaped like isolation. The film's central setup pushes that isolation into Peter's body. As the pressure on Spider-Man intensifies, he begins to undergo a physical evolution that he may not be able to control. This matters because Spider-Man stories have always connected power with responsibility, but responsibility is usually treated as an ethical challenge. Here, it also becomes physical pressure. Peter is not only deciding how much of himself to give. His body appears to be responding to a life in which he has given Spider-Man almost everything. That creates the question guiding this analysis. When Peter devotes his entire identity to being Spider-Man, does the film frame that decision as heroic commitment or as self-erasure that even his changing body can no longer sustain? The distinction is important. Commitment has direction. It means choosing a burden because something beyond the self deserves protection. Self-erasure is different. It can resemble courage from the outside while slowly removing the person who made the choice. Peter still saves people, still answers danger, and still acts from a moral instinct that remains recognizably his. Yet if Peter Parker exists only in the pauses between emergencies, then the victory of Spider-Man may also become the disappearance of Peter. This is where the film's invisible threat becomes more than a convenient enemy. A villain who cannot be seen naturally creates uncertainty around space, trust, and perception. Peter can react to destruction, but the source remains hidden. On a thematic level, that danger mirrors his internal condition. The city sees Spider-Man's actions without knowing Peter. His friends continue their lives without seeing the sacrifice that made their freedom possible. Even Peter may struggle to recognize what his devotion is turning him into. Visibility in this story is not merely about whether an eye can locate an enemy. It is about whether a person can still be understood when every sign of his private identity has been removed. The most revealing conflict may therefore be less about defeating a powerful opponent than about deciding what deserves to survive inside the hero. Spider-Man is the part of Peter that the city needs. Peter Parker is the part that carries memory, affection, regret, and the possibility of a future not measured by the next emergency. A simpler film could treat those identities as rivals and ask him to choose one. A deeper reading asks whether either identity can remain healthy without the other. Brand New Day arrives after a conclusion that transformed loss into an act of responsibility. Peter accepted anonymity because restoring the world demanded it. The moral power of that choice came from its finality. This new chapter begins by examining what finality feels like after the heroic moment has passed. Sacrifice may be noble in the instant of decision, but living inside it is a separate challenge. The applause is gone. The witnesses are gone. What remains is routine, and routine can turn even a meaningful sacrifice into a system of survival. So the film begins under the promise of renewal while carrying the weight of a life deliberately erased. Its deepest pressure is not simply that Peter is alone. It is that loneliness may now feel useful to him because it allows Spider-Man to operate without interruption. The danger is not only what this choice takes away, it is how easily Peter may begin to mistake that absence for purpose. Before judging where the movie takes that idea, the first task is to understand the experience it offers on the surface, and the expectations created by a Spider-Man story that calls isolation a new beginning, the immediate surprise of Spider-Man. Brand New Day is how little it behaves like a victory lap. The title promises renewal, the costume announces a cleaner beginning, and the film's place in the larger franchise suggests a fresh phase. Yet its first impression is defined less by expansion than by subtraction. Peter has fewer relationships, fewer places where he can stop performing, and fewer reasons to imagine a future beyond the next emergency. The result feels more mature not because it becomes relentlessly dark, but because it understands that adulthood often turns dramatic choices into ordinary routines. That shift changes the genre balance. The film still offers the movement, humor, physical spectacle, and sudden reversals expected from a major superhero release. It also brings Spider-Man closer to the streets of New York, where danger feels connected to neighborhoods, daily work, and people who cannot be reduced to pieces on a global strategy board. Yet the movie does not remain a simple street-level adventure. Its invisible threat and Peter's physical transformation pull it towards psychological thriller territory, while the return of people from his former life gives the story the tension of an unfinished relationship drama. These elements do not always sit together comfortably, and that is both the film's attraction and its first limitation. Brand New Day wants the audience to enjoy the agility of Spider-Man while worrying about what that agility is costing Peter. It wants familiar characters to produce warmth without canceling the loneliness created by No Way Home. It wants a threatening mystery, comic friction, franchise connections, and an intimate emotional question to share the same space. At its best, the mixture makes the movie feel unstable in a productive way. At weaker moments, the machinery becomes visible, and one can feel the screenplay arranging people and complications because a large sequel is expected to keep several doors open at once. Destin Daniel Cretton's direction supports that intention by giving bodies and spaces more weight than the previous films often allowed. Peter's movement can still be elastic and exhilarating, yet the camera is also interested in the moment after impact, when confidence falls away and a choice has to be made. New York is not merely a route between set pieces. It becomes a collection of distances Peter can cross physically but not emotionally. That visual emphasis helps the quieter passages feel connected to the action rather than suspended between it. The strongest immediate quality is Tom Holland's control of that divided tone. His earlier version of Peter often moved quickly from embarrassment to excitement, as though thought and emotion arrived at the same speed as his reflexes. Here, the performance creates more distance between what Peter feels and what Spider-Man allows others to see. The humor remains, but it often functions as pressure release rather than personality alone. A pause before a response, a glance held after someone turns away, or a sudden return to movement can communicate that Peter is constantly editing himself. Holland does not need to make the character joyless to show that joy now requires effort. Zendaya's presence sharpens this effect because MJ is not simply a reward waiting for Peter to restore the past. She represents a life that has developed beyond his private version of it. The emotional tension does not come only from whether she might remember him. It comes from whether Peter can accept that love does not give him ownership over another person's interrupted history. Their connection gives the movie its most human pressure, especially when familiarity appears without a complete explanation. The scenes work because the film allows recognition and distance to exist together rather than treating memory as a switch that will automatically repair everything. The newer relationships provide a different kind of energy. Frank Castle's uncompromising approach places Peter's moral instincts under immediate stress, creating friction that is more useful than a conventional team-up. Their contrast is not merely about methods. It asks whether Peter's refusal to become harder is a practical weakness or the principle preventing his pain from remaking him. Sadie Sink's character adds another unstable element, carrying emotional importance without initially explaining exactly how she fits into Peter's changing condition. The film uses that uncertainty to widen its central concern. Isolation is not unique to the hero, even when his circumstances are extraordinary. The first meaningful reservation is that the film sometimes trusts accumulation more than concentration. There are enough characters, transformations, threats, comic exchanges, and future-facing implications to make the narrative feel crowded. Some action passages continue after their emotional point has already landed, and certain supporting appearances momentarily pull attention away from the more compelling question of Peter's identity. Spectacle is not the enemy of the film's intimacy, but it occasionally interrupts rather than expresses it. Still, Brand New Day is not primarily selling the comfort of repetition. It is most effective when it returns Spider-Man to a recognizable moral scale, while allowing Peter's internal crisis to become strange, physical, and difficult to control. Viewers looking mainly for constant cameos, multiverse escalation, or a complete restoration of the old group may find the movie more hesitant and emotionally demanding than expected. Those who connect with Spider-Man as a character defined by responsibility, loneliness, humor, and stubborn compassion are more likely to appreciate its direction. The film's first read, then, is of an ambitious reset that succeeds more through performance and emotional tension than through perfect structural control. It gives Peter a new external threat, but its real momentum comes from a more personal mechanism. Every attempt to live only as Spider-Man increases the pressure on the part of him he has tried to leave behind. The story begins with a Peter Parker who has converted loss into routine. 4 years after the world forgot him, he no longer divides his days between school, friendship, romance, and heroism. He lives alone, works without recognition, and treats crime fighting as a full-time obligation. That choice appears efficient. No one close to him can be threatened because of knowing his identity, and no ordinary commitment can delay him when the city needs help. Yet the apparent solution contains the problem that drives the film. Peter has removed almost every competing demand from his life, so Spider-Man has become both his purpose and his method of avoiding the pain attached to being Peter Parker. The screenplay does not need an elaborate incident to force him into action because he is already in motion. He patrols because stopping would leave him alone with memories nobody else shares. This gives the early action a slightly different dramatic function from the usual superhero opening. Each intervention proves his competence, but it also reveals a narrowing life. The more effective he becomes behind the mask, the less practice he has being visible without it. Heroism and avoidance begin to occupy the same movement. That is the story's first engine. Peter wants to protect New York by becoming completely available to it. The obstacle is not simply a villain strong enough to challenge him. It is that a person cannot remain endlessly available without being changed by the pressure. His body begins reacting in unfamiliar ways. Headaches, altered responses, and an evolution of his powers suggest that the boundary between Peter and Spider-Man is no longer stable. What he has treated as a moral decision now produces a physical consequence. At the same time, a strange pattern of crimes develops across the city. The threat is difficult to locate because it does not behave like a conventional opponent occupying one visible position. Its influence appears through other people and institutions, making every confrontation uncertain. Peter can respond to the damage, but identifying the source requires more than strength or speed. The danger is especially effective because it attacks his preferred way of solving problems. He has built a life around immediate action. This enemy demands interpretation, patience, and trust, precisely the capacities his isolation has weakened. The early involvement of Mac Gargan, the Scorpion, gives the mystery a recognizable surface. Peter knows how to read a criminal with a personal grievance and a physical advantage. What unsettles him is the sense that the visible attacker may not be the true author of the violence. The situation begins pointing toward the Department of Damage Control and the systems surrounding enhanced individuals, widening the conflict beyond one returning adversary. This is where the film's central want becomes more complicated. Peter says, through his actions, that he wants to keep everyone safe. Beneath that goal sits a quieter desire to make his sacrifice permanent and meaningful. If the people he loves are happy without him, and if the city continuously needs Spider-Man, then his loneliness can be interpreted as proof that he made the correct choice. Reconnecting with MJ or Ned would threaten that explanation. It would require him to admit that sacrifice does not eliminate desire, and that protecting someone from pain can also deny them the ability to choose what risks they are willing to share. The film therefore keeps his old relationships close enough to disturb him, but not close enough to provide easy comfort. MJ and Ned have continued living inside a history from which Peter has been removed. He can observe evidence of the bond they once shared, yet he cannot simply step back into it. His private knowledge creates an emotional imbalance. He remembers what they meant to one another while they encounter him without the same context. The tension is not built around whether he can deliver the correct explanation. It comes from whether he has the moral right to disrupt lives that have already reorganized themselves around his absence. His choice at the end of the previous film was not merely a magical accident. It was an attempt to give MJ and Ned safety at a cost he accepted for them. The new film pressures that decision without immediately declaring it mistaken. Peter's longing is real, but longing alone does not make reconnection responsible. The story gains momentum from the distance between what he emotionally wants and what he believes his duty permits. The choice that locks him more deeply into the plot arrives when the bodily changes and the citywide threat become impossible to treat as separate problems. Peter initially approaches each symptom as something to manage while continuing his patrols. This is consistent with his new identity. If his body hurts, he adjusts. If a power behaves unpredictably, he compensates. If a crime pattern grows stranger, he works longer. Asking for help would mean admitting that full-time Spider-Man is not a complete system. The crisis becomes irreversible when he can no longer guarantee that his changing abilities are under his control. That loss of certainty carries a larger cost than personal injury. Spider-Man's moral authority depends on restraint. Peter possesses enough strength to cause enormous harm, so his heroism is measured partly by the care with which he uses it. A physical evolution that intensifies or alters his responses threatens that discipline. The possibility that he might misjudge a movement, react too forcefully, or become influenced by the same unseen power he is pursuing transforms every rescue into a test. Failure would not simply mean losing a fight. It could mean becoming another source of danger in a city that trusts the mask more than it knows the person. This pressure forces Peter toward people he would rather keep at a distance. Bruce Banner represents one obvious route because his life has been shaped by the relationship between identity, emotion, and physical transformation. Peter approaches the situation as though he needs a diagnosis. The deeper challenge is accepting that control may require relationship rather than isolation. The meeting matters less as a crossover connection than as a confrontation between two people whose bodies refuse to remain separate from their emotional pressure. Frank Castle creates the opposite pressure. Where Banner reflects the danger of losing control, Castle represents the temptation to simplify responsibility. Both men respond to a violent city, but their moral boundaries are radically different. Peter's refusal to use permanent force is not an ornamental rule. It is one of the remaining structures connecting Spider-Man to Peter Parker. When his body becomes less predictable and the enemy becomes harder to identify, Castle's certainty can look efficient. The story uses that contrast to ask whether Peter's compassion can survive when restraint makes his tasks slower, riskier, and more painful. The key relationship driving the narrative is therefore not limited to a single partnership. It is the unstable relationship between Peter and every person who challenges his belief that he must operate alone. MJ and Ned expose the emotional cost of his decision. Banner exposes the physical danger of suppressing one side of the self. Castle tests the ethical line Peter claims he will not cross. The mysterious new figure connected to the spreading crisis introduces the possibility that his transformation belongs to a larger pattern he does not yet understand. Each relationship applies pressure to a different part of the same defense, the idea that Peter can protect everyone by removing himself from their lives. The crimes increase the demands on Spider-Man. Increased activity worsens the transformation. The transformation makes secrecy harder to maintain. Secrecy prevents Peter from receiving the help he needs. His isolation then drives him back into more patrol work, where the cycle begins again. This circular structure is the real mechanism beneath the action. Every attempt to solve the problem through greater commitment feeds the condition, making him less reliable. Delay becomes important within that mechanism. Peter does not refuse help because he lacks intelligence. He refuses it because accepting help would challenge the meaning he has assigned to the last 4 years. If he can remain alone and still function, then the pain has a purpose. If he needs the people he left behind, the sacrifice becomes emotionally less tidy. The film allows him to postpone that recognition through practical distractions. Another emergency, another clue, another person in danger. Action becomes the respectable language of avoidance. The unseen antagonist benefits from this pattern. An isolated hero has fewer perspectives against which to test what he perceives. When an enemy can move through influence, possession, or hidden control, certainty becomes dangerous. Peter's instincts are extraordinary, but instinct cannot replace trust. The threat does not merely conceal itself from his eyes. It exploits the structure of a life in which no one is close enough to notice when he begins behaving differently. That possibility raises the cost of failure beyond the immediate attacks. If Peter loses control of his changing body, the enemy gains access to one of the city's most powerful defenders. If he withdraws further, he becomes easier to manipulate. If he reconnects carelessly with the people he loves, he may pull them back into danger. Peter is not searching for a path with no consequences. He is searching for the consequence he can live with. The film's story engine is strongest when it recognizes that this is the true inheritance of the previous ending. Peter did not receive a clean slate. He inherited responsibility without recognition, love without mutual memory, and power without a stable private identity. The new threat turns those emotional conditions into practical weaknesses. It attacks a hero who has mistaken self-sufficiency for safety, and asks whether he can change before his body, his enemy, or his own loneliness makes the decision for him. By the time the narrative approaches its decisive revelations, the important question is no longer simply who is directing the strange crimes. It is what Peter's response to uncertainty reveals about the person beneath the mask. Pressure has begun stripping away the efficiency of his new life. What remains is the choice he has delayed for years, whether protecting others requires his disappearance, or whether the refusal to be known has become another danger he must finally confront. Peter Parker's visible goal is almost impossibly simple. Protect New York for as many hours of the day as his body will allow. 4 years after the world forgot him, he has removed nearly every competing obligation from his life and devoted himself to being Spider-Man full-time. From the outside, that can look like discipline. Under pressure, it begins to resemble a defense mechanism. Peter does not merely want to stop crime. He wants usefulness to silence grief, because usefulness can be measured while loneliness cannot. The city gives him problems he can reach with a web. His private life gives him absences he cannot repair without risking the meaning of his sacrifice. His less visible need is not simply companionship. It is permission to exist as someone whose value is not earned through rescue. Peter has spent so long connecting love with danger that ordinary closeness now feels morally suspicious. If he wants MJ back in his life, he must confront the possibility that his desire could disturb the safety he chose for her. If he stays away, he can describe the pain as responsibility. That makes isolation emotionally efficient. It hurts, but it also protects him from asking whether he made a noble decision once and then turned it into a permanent excuse. This is Peter's central contradiction. He believes responsibility means accepting consequences, yet he avoids one of the most difficult consequences of his choice, continuing to live as a complete person afterward. The mask allows him to be generous without being vulnerable. He can enter a stranger's crisis, offer everything, and leave before anyone asks what he needs. That pattern preserves the heroic image while starving the human being inside it. The film's pressure comes from making that arrangement physically and emotionally unsustainable. Tom Holland communicates this division by changing Peter's rhythm rather than abandoning the character's familiar energy. Spider-Man can still respond quickly, joke under stress, and convert fear into movement. Peter is slower. He seems to measure what can safely be revealed before allowing a sentence or expression to escape. The distance between those rhythms tells us that the mask is no longer hiding only a name. It is hiding exhaustion, longing, and the fear that being known will undo the only structure he trusts. Holland is most persuasive when confidence appears as something Peter activates rather than naturally possesses. The film does not present his wound as a single traumatic memory waiting for one emotional speech. It is a pattern built from repetition. Peter sees people he loves continuing without him. He protects citizens who may never know what he gave up. He returns to a private space where success cannot become intimacy. Together, those experiences create a life in which self-denial begins to feel normal. The danger is that Peter stops recognizing it as a choice. He starts treating loneliness as part of the costume. MJ applies the most precise pressure because she represents both what Peter wants and what his moral logic tells him to avoid. The film does not reduce her to a lost prize. She has her own direction and emotional boundaries. Peter remembers a history that she cannot access in the same way, producing an imbalance that affection cannot automatically solve. His knowledge gives him emotional certainty, but it does not give him authority over her present life. That distinction forces him to examine whether protecting someone includes respecting the person she has become without him. Zendaya strengthens this tension through control. MJ's intelligence has always appeared partly as suspicion, the instinct to study a room before trusting it. Here, that quality gives her encounters with Peter an unusual charge. Familiarity may register in fragments, but the performance does not turn those fragments into instant restoration. A held look can suggest curiosity without promising memory. A warmer response can coexist with caution. Zendaya lets the audience feel the possibility of connection while preserving MJ's independence, preventing Peter's longing from becoming the only emotional truth. Their relationship exposes Peter's deepest fear, not merely that MJ could be harmed, but that she could choose a life in which he no longer belongs. Danger is easier for Peter to confront than another person's freedom. A villain can be resisted. A choice made by someone he loves must be respected. His restraint around MJ can therefore be read as both maturity and avoidance. He refuses to force the past upon her, which is ethically serious. He also uses that seriousness to delay the vulnerability of telling the truth and accepting whatever answer follows. The opposing force works on several levels. The unseen threat challenges Peter's ability to identify where danger begins. His changing body challenges his belief that discipline alone can maintain control. Most importantly, Peter's self-deception converts each external problem into confirmation that he should become more isolated. Because the danger is difficult to see, he assumes he must rely more heavily on himself. Because his powers are changing, he hides the instability until he understands it. Every protective instinct pushes him toward the condition, making him easier to break. Bruce Banner functions as a warning against that logic. His presence carries the history of a man whose physical power cannot be separated from emotion, identity, or fear. The useful contrast is not that Banner possesses a simple answer Peter lacks. It is that he understands control as an ongoing relationship with the self, not a switch secured through willpower. Peter approaches transformation as another technical problem to overcome. Banner's experience suggests that denying part of oneself often gives that part more destructive power. The pressure he applies is quiet but severe. Peter may not save himself by treating Peter Parker as the weakness in Spider-Man. Frank Castle tests the opposite side of Peter's identity. Where Banner complicates control, Castle simplifies action. He sees a dangerous world and responds with certainty, reducing hesitation by removing moral options Peter considers essential. Their friction matters because Peter is tired enough to understand the appeal of that certainty. Restraint requires patience, and patience becomes harder when an invisible enemy keeps raising the cost. Castle represents more than a disagreement about methods. He represents the possibility that pain can turn a protector into someone who values ending a threat more than the person he becomes while doing it. Peter's response to Castle reveals that his moral limits are among the last surviving expressions of his private identity. He may have abandoned relationships, recognition, and the expectation of an ordinary future, but he has not abandoned the belief that power must be restrained by care. That belief comes from Peter Parker's losses and his refusal to make other people pay for them. When Castle challenges it, the film asks whether Peter can preserve compassion without rebuilding the human life that gave compassion meaning. The new figure played by Sadie Sink places pressure on a different weakness: Peter's instinct to recognize pain in others while concealing it in himself. Her presence carries enough uncertainty to prevent an immediate reading, but her emotional function is clear. Peter encounters someone whose situation cannot be solved by arriving, defeating an attacker, and leaving. Helping requires attention to identity, fear, and transformation. That demand mirrors his own crisis. He can see another person's isolation as dangerous long before he admits the same about himself. The supporting characters work best when each becomes a possible answer to Peter's problem. MJ represents connection without ownership. Banner represents integration rather than denial. Castle represents certainty purchased by moral contraction. The mysterious newcomer represents pain made visible through change. Their value lies in the pressure they apply, not in how many future stories they might support. When the film forgets that function, the ensemble feels crowded. When it remembers, the cast forms a map of the person Peter could become. Peter's physical evolution turns this character map into a crisis. His body expresses what his language refuses to admit. The current arrangement cannot continue unchanged. The transformation is frightening because it removes the separation Peter depends upon. He wants Spider-Man to contain strength, action, and sacrifice while Peter quietly absorbs the cost. As those boundaries collapse, the consequences of his emotional choices enter the visible world. The private wound can no longer remain private. This is where performance and theme meet. Holland plays Peter as someone attempting to stay one decision ahead of exposure. Zendaya plays MJ as someone who cannot be reduced to Peter's memory of her. The surrounding characters challenge different forms of avoidance. The film's pressure is not designed merely to reveal whether Peter is powerful enough. It reveals what he hides, what he is willing to sacrifice again, and whether he can distinguish responsibility from disappearance. The most important question is not who Peter becomes when pressure makes him stronger. It is who remains when strength stops protecting him from himself. His visible goal demands that he save the city. His hidden need demands that he accept a life in which saving others does not require erasing Peter Parker. The deeper argument of Brand New Day begins where those demands collide. A hero cannot remain humane by treating his own humanity as expendable. On the surface, Spider-Man. Brand New Day is about a hero whose powers are changing while an unseen enemy threatens New York. Beneath that structure, the film keeps returning to a more intimate pattern. Peter Parker has confused being absent with keeping people safe. His sacrifice removed him from the memories of those he loved, but the years that followed turned a single painful decision into a complete way of living. The movie's central thread is not simply whether Peter can control his transformation. It is whether he can recognize that control has already shaped his entire identity. The title appears to promise a clean beginning, yet the film repeatedly shows that Peter has not truly begun again. A new beginning requires some willingness to enter an unknown future. Peter instead organizes his life around preserving the meaning of the past. He continues protecting the city because responsibility remains real, but he also uses that responsibility to avoid the uncertainty of becoming someone new. He is active every day without necessarily moving forward. That contradiction gives the phrase, Brand New Day, a slightly painful irony. Peter's circumstances have changed completely, but his emotional attention remains directed toward people and relationships that no longer exist in the same form. He knows what MJ and Ned once meant to him. They know only the lives they have built since forgetting him. Peter therefore occupies a private timeline that nobody else can confirm. To him, the past is emotionally present. To them, it is an empty space. Memory becomes more than a missing collection of facts. It determines who has the power to define a relationship. Peter remembers shared danger, affection, mistakes, promises, and sacrifice. That knowledge creates the temptation to believe he understands what everyone should want, yet the film gradually separates memory from entitlement. Remembering that someone loved you does not guarantee that you can return and demand the same place in that person's present. Peter's memories are emotionally valid, but they do not erase the independence of the people who continued without him. This is why his loneliness cannot be resolved by simply restoring the old group. The deeper issue is not access to friendship. It is Peter's belief that connection and protection are mutually exclusive. He imagines two possible lives. In one, he is close to the people he loves and exposes them to danger. In the other, he remains alone and keeps them safe. The film's underlying pattern challenges that division by showing the dangers created by isolation itself. A Peter who trusts nobody has fewer emotional anchors, fewer perspectives, and fewer people capable of recognizing when something inside him has changed. The physical transformation gives visible form to that hidden imbalance. Peter has attempted to divide himself into useful and vulnerable parts. Spider-Man receives the strength, movement, humor, courage, and responsibility. Peter Parker is left to carry grief in private. That arrangement can function only while the boundary between the two identities remains stable. Once his body begins changing beyond his control, the separation collapses. The mask can no longer contain the consequences of the life beneath it. The transformation is therefore not merely an upgrade or a new obstacle. It asks what happens when a person treats emotional pressure as irrelevant until the body refuses to cooperate. Peter's powers have always translated inner responsibility into outward action. He senses danger and responds. He possesses strength and must decide how carefully to use it. Here, the same connection becomes disturbing. His body begins expressing a truth his conscious routine has suppressed. He cannot remain endlessly useful while pretending that loss has no continuing effect. Control is one of the movie's most important supporting ideas because Peter defines it too narrowly. He believes control means continuing to perform despite discomfort. A power changes, so he compensates. A movement becomes uncertain, so he concentrates harder. An emotional encounter unsettles him, so he returns to patrol. This version of control is based on concealment. As long as nobody sees the difficulty, Peter can tell himself the system still works. The film offers another understanding. Control may require recognition rather than suppression. It may begin with admitting what is happening, allowing another person to observe it, and accepting that self-knowledge is not the same as solitary discipline. That possibility threatens Peter because it would make dependence part of his responsibility. He is comfortable giving help. Receiving it would require him to reveal the person whose needs he has treated as dangerous. The unseen villain extends this argument into the external conflict. A visible enemy gives Peter a target. He can judge distance, read movement, and direct force toward a known source. An enemy who cannot be seen removes that certainty. Damage appears without providing a stable object to strike. Other people may be influenced, manipulated, or placed between the hero and the real threat. Peter's most immediate abilities become less reliable because action arrives before complete understanding. This threat reflects his emotional life with unusual precision. Peter is surrounded by the effects of something others cannot see. Nobody remembers the history shaping his behavior. MJ and Ned can observe his present actions without sharing the emotional evidence behind them. The city knows Spider-Man through rescues and destruction, not through the private cost that produces them. Peter himself sees the symptoms of his transformation without fully understanding the pressure beneath them. Across every level of the story, consequence becomes visible while cause remains hidden. The film does not suggest that invisibility automatically means evil. Peter's private sacrifice is also invisible, and it began as an act of love. The problem appears when invisibility prevents accountability and connection. The villain benefits from being impossible to locate. Peter's pain gains power because it remains impossible for others to name. His anonymity protects people, but it also prevents them from deciding how they wish to respond to him. The movie's pattern is not that everything hidden must be exposed. It is that hidden power becomes dangerous when no relationship can test or challenge it. Peter's living space reinforces this reading. His apartment is less a home than a station between patrols, filled with the practical remains of a life organized around Spider-Man. Equipment, screens, unfinished routines, and ordinary clutter suggest activity without settlement. The space contains evidence that Peter survives there, but less evidence that he expects to grow there. It protects his secret identity while revealing how little of an identity remains beyond the secret. New York provides the opposite image. The city is crowded, moving, noisy, and full of lives crossing one another. Peter can travel across it with extraordinary freedom, yet his movement often keeps him above or outside ordinary connection. Spider-Man can reach almost any emergency, while Peter struggles to cross the smaller emotional distance between himself and another person. Physical mobility becomes a contrast to emotional suspension. He is never still, but he remains trapped inside the same decision. That spatial contradiction gives his web swinging a different meaning. The web is a tool of connection. It attaches Peter to buildings, allows him to redirect momentum, and keeps him from falling by creating temporary relationships with the environment around him. Yet the person using it has designed a life around permanent detachment. The hero's most recognizable power depends upon reaching outward, while Peter's emotional strategy depends upon cutting ties. The movie appears to ask whether responsibility can exist without mutuality. Peter's traditional moral code emphasizes what the powerful owe to others. Brand New Day does not reject that principle. It adds a complication. Responsibility also requires acknowledging that other people possess agency. Peter cannot decide every risk for MJ simply because his fear is understandable. He cannot protect the city effectively if he hides information that could make him unsafe. He cannot preserve his compassion indefinitely while denying himself every relationship that nourishes it. This does not make his original sacrifice meaningless. The film is careful not to reduce the end of No Way Home to a mistake that must be reversed. At the moment Peter made the choice, the danger was immediate and the cost was necessary. The deeper question concerns what he did afterward. A sacrifice can be morally justified without becoming a permanent model for living. Peter's difficulty is that changing course feels like betraying the seriousness of what he gave up. Grief often creates this kind of loyalty to pain. Moving forward can feel like admitting that the lost person, relationship, or former self no longer matters. Peter protects the past by refusing to build a future that might replace it. His devotion to Spider-Man allows him to honor everyone he could not save, but it also keeps him close to the emotional conditions of those losses. The film suggests that healing is frightening partly because it removes pain from its position as proof of love. MJ's presence complicates that pattern because she is neither a symbol waiting to be recovered nor a simple reminder to move on. She embodies the difference between remembering a person and meeting who that person is now. Peter must decide whether he sees her as an individual in the present or as the final missing piece of his previous life. The more honestly he recognizes her independence, the less possible it becomes to imagine restoration as a return to exactly what existed before. This is where the movie remains productively ambiguous. Peter's distance can be interpreted as respect, fear, or both. His full-time heroism can be read as extraordinary service and emotional avoidance. His transformation may be a threat, but it may also force a necessary evolution that his chosen routine would never permit. Even the invisible enemy functions in two directions. It represents danger without a clear source, while also compelling Peter to admit that not every problem can be solved through direct action. The film's central interpretation is therefore not that Peter should stop being Spider-Man in order to become Peter Parker again. That would preserve the same false division in reverse. The deeper possibility is integration. Spider-Man's courage, restraint, humor, and compassion come from Peter. Peter's ordinary needs do not weaken the hero. They provide the relationships and values that keep his power human. The pressure of the story exposes what happens when one identity consumes the other. Peter believes complete devotion will make Spider-Man more effective, yet the transformation suggests that a life without balance eventually changes the nature of the power itself. The city may need Spider-Man, but Spider-Man also needs a Peter Parker capable of being known, corrected, supported, and loved. A brand new day does not require forgetting everything that came before. Peter already lives in a world built upon forgetting, and that has not made him free. Renewal begins when the past is carried without being allowed to dictate every future choice. The movie's guiding question is gradually becoming clearer. Peter's commitment remains heroic because he continues to protect people who cannot thank him for what he sacrificed. It becomes self-erasure when he assumes that protection requires the permanent disappearance of the person doing the protecting. That distinction cannot be settled through an abstract lesson. It must be tested in the film's specific encounters, where framing, movement, silence, performance, and distance reveal whether Peter is truly rebuilding his life or only finding more elaborate ways to remain unseen. The first scene worth placing under the microscope is not a battle. It is Peter's passage between a small neighborhood shop, Aunt May's grave, and the attic apartment where he has built his new life. Nothing in this movement is complicated, yet the film treats ordinary space as evidence. Peter can cross the city with impossible speed, but the places in which he removes the mask feel narrow, provisional, and emotionally unfinished. The visit to buy flowers is staged with a deliberate lack of spectacle. Peter enters as one more customer, without the visual authority Spider-Man receives above the streets. The camera remains close enough to register his restraint but does not force the scene into a public display of grief. The flowers are a practical object before they become an emotional one. He chooses them, carries them, and continues with the quiet routine of remembering someone the world cannot return to him. The movement to the grave also changes how we understand his full-time heroism. Peter's patrols can look like pure commitment when viewed from a distance. Placed beside this private ritual, they begin to look like part of a repeated cycle. He protects strangers, returns to the memory of the person who taught him what responsibility costs, and then goes back into the city before grief can become conversation. The editing turns service and mourning into neighboring activities. Spider-Man is not simply what Peter does after loss. It has become the route through which he keeps loss active. His apartment completes the idea through production design. The space is functional, cluttered, and arranged around the demands of the suit. Equipment and unfinished tasks occupy more visual attention than anything suggesting comfort or permanence. The room tells us that Peter has improved his ability to operate while neglecting his ability to live. It is less a home than a workshop attached to a place where he sleeps. The attic location intensifies that impression. Peter is physically placed above ordinary domestic life, close to the roofs from which Spider-Man enters the city and separated from the people living below. The vertical position seems ideal for a superhero, but emotionally it resembles withdrawal. He has built a private world at the edge of everyone else's. The scene does not need to announce his loneliness because the architecture performs it. Tom Holland's timing inside the apartment is crucial. His movements have purpose when he handles the suit or studies the city. When no task demands attention, the rhythm weakens. A pause near a screen or a glance toward images of MJ and Ned creates a different kind of stillness, one that Peter quickly interrupts by returning to work. The performance shows avoidance through acceleration. He does not collapse dramatically. He finds another useful thing to do. The second scene changes scale completely, the truck chase that pushes the hidden crime pattern into the open. The sequence initially offers the familiar pleasures of Spider-Man in motion. Vehicles create direction, the streets create obstacles, and Peter's abilities allow him to treat a dangerous route as a flexible three-dimensional space. Yet the scene becomes more interesting when the film refuses to give him a stable opponent. The camera's mobility usually supports Spider-Man's confidence. It can travel with him, rotate around him, and preserve the clarity of his movement even when the environment becomes chaotic. In this chase, that freedom is repeatedly complicated by uncertainty. Peter can see the immediate danger, but he cannot confidently identify the intelligence guiding it. The action is clear at the level of bodies and vehicles, while remaining unclear at the level of intention. That distinction places the audience inside Peter's limitation. We understand what must be stopped before we understand what is causing it. The editing provides enough spatial information to follow the rescue, but it withholds the certainty that would turn the sequence into a simple pursuit. A person who appears responsible may be only a temporary carrier of another will. Every successful intervention can therefore solve the visible problem while missing the source. The truck itself becomes more than a moving obstacle. It is a container whose momentum has been directed by something Peter cannot locate. That makes it a useful image for the film's larger concern. Peter is also moving quickly under pressures he has not fully named. He believes he controls the direction because he continues choosing the next action, yet the pattern of those choices may be carrying him toward a transformation he does not understand. Sound helps maintain this tension. The mechanical force of the vehicle, the interruptions of impact, and the changing city noise keep the threat tangible even when its author remains invisible. Spider-Man's humor appears against that pressure, but it cannot completely domesticate the sequence. The jokes provide rhythm and preserve Peter's familiar voice. The soundscape continues reminding us that confidence has not produced knowledge. The scene's most important shift occurs when Peter's physical response no longer feels entirely familiar to him. The sequence does not stop to explain every symptom. Instead, performance and movement briefly fall out of alignment. Spider-Man completes an action, but Peter's reaction suggests that his body has supplied more force, speed, or sensation than he expected. The disturbance is small enough to avoid revealing the later answers, yet precise enough to change the meaning of the spectacle. The audience is no longer watching only what Spider-Man can do. We are watching whether Peter still recognizes the person doing it. The third sequence develops the unseen antagonist through choreography rather than conventional visual effects. Before the character's full nature is explained, the film presents a presence that exists through the behavior of other people. A glance changes direction. A body pauses with an intention that does not seem to belong to it. Movement passes through a group without the camera offering one visible figure to claim it. This is an effective solution because literal invisibility can easily become visually empty. The film instead makes absence readable through reaction. Blocking becomes the evidence of a character the audience cannot yet see. People create space around something without understanding why. Attention travels across the frame as though following an unseen line. The result is not merely a blank area surrounded by effects. It is a pattern of human behavior pointing toward a concealed center. The camera participates by refusing to settle upon the expected source of power. It may begin with the person Peter assumes is responsible, then shift after a reaction reveals that the controlling presence has already moved elsewhere. These changes make observation active. The viewer has to read posture, eye line, timing, and negative space rather than waiting for a costume to identify the villain. Sadie Sink's performance is central even when the character's appearance is withheld or displaced. The film builds a personality through rhythm before it provides a complete image. That reverses the usual introduction of a major comic book figure, where design often arrives before interiority. Here, the character first exists as pressure exerted upon the frame. The mystery works not because the movie simply refuses a name, but because it asks how a person can remain a person when expression depends on other bodies. This sequence tests the deep view question from the opposite direction. Peter has made himself invisible socially while remaining highly visible as Spider-Man. The antagonist is physically absent yet increasingly present through influence. Both forms of invisibility create power, but both also damage identity. Peter can act without being known. The hidden presence can act without being held in one body. The scene quietly asks whether identity survives when nobody can connect action to a stable human self. Across these three scenes, the film uses different scales to examine the same pressure. The apartment turns isolation into architecture. The truck chase turns uncertainty into motion. The invisible introduction turns identity into choreography. None of them needs a full explanation to advance the argument. They allow space, editing, sound, and performance to show what Peter has not yet admitted. Losing control begins long before a hero visibly fails. It begins when movement, purpose, and identity no longer belong to the same person. The craft of Spider-Man. Brand New Day works best when several departments express the same contradiction at once. Peter Parker is faster, stronger, and more experienced than before, yet his life has become smaller. The film does not communicate that tension through dialogue alone. Direction, cinematography, production design, editing, sound, visual effects, and performance repeatedly place freedom and confinement inside the same image. Destin Daniel Cretton's most important decision is to keep Peter's emotional condition connected to the physical world. The movie could have treated his loneliness as material for a few quiet scenes placed between action sequences. Instead, isolation shapes how the action is framed. Peter moves through a crowded city while remaining emotionally separate from almost everyone inside it. New York is full of faces, traffic, windows, apartments, shops, and overlapping lives, but Spider-Man often experiences it as a field of emergencies rather than a community in which he belongs. That approach gives the city more dramatic value than scale alone could provide. The streets are not simply obstacles beneath a swinging hero. They represent the ordinary life Peter can observe but struggles to enter. A lit apartment window, a conversation glimpsed from a distance, or a group moving together can carry more emotional force than another skyline because these details remind us that Peter's problem is not access. He can reach almost anywhere. What he cannot easily do is remain. Brett Pollack's cinematography supports this distinction by changing its visual priorities between Spider-Man and Peter. During movement, the camera often treats Spider-Man as a clear graphic shape. The red and blue suit stands strongly against the city, giving him the visual certainty of a comic book figure. He appears readable, energetic, and immediately recognizable. Once the mask comes off, the compositions become less secure. Peter is more likely to be surrounded by unfinished space, placed near the edge of a room, or separated from another character by objects and distance. The contrast is not merely decorative. It explains why Spider-Man feels easier for Peter to inhabit. The masked identity arrives with a strong outline. Its responsibilities are immediate, and its success can be measured through action. Peter Parker occupies a less definite frame. His desires conflict, his relationships contain histories that others no longer share, and no physical movement can guarantee the correct emotional result. The film occasionally recreates the bold arrangement of comic book imagery, but the most effective images are not valuable simply because they resemble printed panels. They work when graphic clarity becomes part of the character argument. Spider-Man can look perfectly composed in the middle of danger while Peter is internally uncertain. The image offers heroic confidence at the exact moment the story asks whether that confidence can be trusted. A nighttime passage through rain demonstrates this convergence particularly well. Water gives the city surfaces that reflect and distort the suit's color. Spider-Man remains visually striking, but his outline is surrounded by shifting light rather than stable daylight clarity. Rain also changes the sensation of movement. It adds resistance, makes surfaces appear less dependable, and allows every light source to leave a temporary trace. The sequence preserves the pleasure of web swinging while introducing the feeling that Peter is moving through a world whose boundaries have become less certain. Visual effects are most convincing when they preserve physical consequence. Spider-Man's movement depends upon speed and impossible flexibility, but the film gains weight whenever the digital work respects momentum. A swing should feel connected to an anchor point. A landing should redirect force rather than simply end it. A collision should alter Peter's rhythm. These details matter because the story is concerned with whether his body still obeys the rules he understands. When his changing powers interrupt that familiar movement, the effects become part of the performance. The important detail is not merely that something more spectacular happens, it is Peter's fraction of uncertainty afterward. A movement may carry him farther than intended, or a physical response may arrive before conscious control. The visual effect creates the event, while Holland's reaction creates its meaning. Without that reaction, the transformation would resemble an upgrade. With it, power becomes evidence that Peter may be losing authorship of his own body. Editing controls how quickly that uncertainty reaches the audience. In the strongest action passages, the cuts allow us to understand Peter's intention before something disrupts it. We see what he expects his body or environment to do, then experience the break in that expectation. The interruption may last only a moment, but it changes our relationship to the following movement. Every successful action now carries the possibility of an unseen error. This is also why the action is less effective when it continues after its dramatic point has been established. Length does not automatically deepen pressure. Once the audience understands that Peter is powerful but physically unstable, additional movement must reveal something new about control, character, or consequence. When a sequence repeats the same danger at a larger scale, spectacle begins competing with the film's sharper emotional design. The movie's soundscape frequently restores that missing weight. Spider-Man's movement is accompanied by changes in air, fabric, strain, impact, and the density of the city below him. These sounds create the impression that his body remains connected to an environment rather than floating across a digital background. They also allow small irregularities to become noticeable. An unfamiliar pulse, a distorted sensation, or a moment in which expected sound disappears can suggest that Peter's perception is changing before the screenplay explains why. Silence becomes particularly important around MJ. Action gives Peter permission to respond immediately. Silence removes that protection. In their quieter encounters, a pause can contain memory for him and uncertainty for her. The absence of speech does not mean the scene lacks information. It exposes the imbalance between two people standing in the same place while carrying different versions of their shared past. Holland and Zendaya use this space differently. Holland often appears ready to move toward recognition before restraint pulls him back. His body leans into familiarity while his words attempt to respect distance. Zendaya's performance is more observational. MJ studies Peter's reactions without possessing the history that would explain them. The camera and editing avoid rushing to resolve that imbalance, allowing a glance to remain suggestive without turning it into proof that everything has returned. Production design extends the same argument into Peter's apartment. The room is filled with practical evidence of Spider-Man, but comparatively little evidence of a future Peter is building for himself. Its objects support maintenance, repair, observation, and departure. The space tells us he expects to return from patrol, but not necessarily that he expects his life to change. This design makes the suit's color more meaningful. Against the muted, functional environment, red and blue can look like the most complete identity in the room. Spider-Man occupies Peter's attention, tools, time, and physical space. The costume is not simply something stored inside the apartment. The apartment feels increasingly like something built around the costume. Costume design also participates through condition rather than novelty. The suit can carry repairs, stress, and evidence of use without losing its iconic clarity. That balance reflects Peter himself. He still presents a recognizable heroic surface, but close observation reveals accumulated pressure. The movie does not need to make the costume unrecognizable to show change. Wear becomes a history written onto the symbol. The score is most effective when it resists instructing the audience to feel heroic simply because Spider-Man appears. Familiar musical confidence can emerge during movement, then thin out when Peter's control becomes uncertain. The emotional passages benefit from restraint because the performances already carry longing. Overemphasis would turn Peter's loneliness into melodrama. A lighter musical presence lets grief exist as something habitual rather than constantly announced. Cretton's direction brings these systems together by treating physical action and emotional behavior as parts of one performance. A rescue can reveal Peter's need to remain useful. A joke can hide fear. A transformation can expose suppressed pressure. A room can show how completely one identity has occupied another. The film's craft becomes strongest when no department is merely decorating the plot. The central test is whether all this technique supports the movie's deeper argument. Most of the time it does. The cinematography gives Spider-Man clarity while leaving Peter uncertain. The production design turns isolation into a place. Editing converts unstable power into disrupted expectation. Sound restores weight and makes absence expressive. Performance connects every external change to an internal choice. The weaker moments arrive when visual scale becomes an obligation rather than an expression. A superhero film of this size is expected to provide elaborate movement, recognizable figures, and escalating danger. Brand New Day occasionally meets those expectations without fully translating them into Peter's crisis. Yet when its craft converges, the film achieves something more valuable than spectacle alone. It makes the audience feel the difference between moving freely and living freely, showing that Peter can cross an entire city in seconds while remaining trapped inside a decision he made years ago. The most consequential weakness in Spider-Man. Brand New Day is that its emotional argument is often more focused than its franchise structure. The film understands Peter Parker's crisis with unusual clarity. He has made Spider-Man his entire life, and the resulting isolation is beginning to change him physically as well as emotionally. That idea could support a tightly concentrated character study. The movie, however, must also accommodate returning relationships, a concealed villain, Peter's evolving powers, several established Marvel characters, large-scale action, humor, and possibilities for future stories. These elements do not destroy the central argument, but they repeatedly compete for the attention it needs. The problem is not simply that the film contains many characters. A crowded story can still feel unified when every person applies pressure to the same conflict. Bruce Banner, Frank Castle, MJ, Ned, and the new threat can each illuminate a different part of Peter's struggle. Banner challenges his understanding of bodily control. Castle tests his moral restraint. MJ and Ned expose the consequences of choosing isolation for other people. The antagonist turns hidden influence into an external reflection of Peter's invisible life. The difficulty appears when these characters briefly stop functioning as parts of Peter's story and begin operating as announcements of their own importance. A familiar entrance can shift the audience's attention from what the moment means to what it might set up. Recognition becomes the primary pleasure. The film then feels less like one complete argument and more like a central drama surrounded by doors leading toward other projects. Frank Castle creates the clearest example of both the benefit and the limitation. His uncompromising approach gives Peter a useful ethical opponent. Peter has every reason to become harsher. He is exhausted, isolated, physically unstable, and facing an enemy that makes restraint difficult. Castle's certainty therefore tests whether Spider-Man's compassion is a genuine principle or a luxury that survives only under manageable conditions. That conflict is valuable because it places Peter's morality under practical pressure. Yet some of their interaction leans heavily on the entertainment of contrast. Spider-Man's movement and humor collide with Castle's blunt seriousness, producing energetic friction. Once the ethical difference has been established, however, repeated exchanges can begin restating the same opposition. The scenes remain enjoyable, but enjoyment and development are not identical. The film occasionally keeps the pairing active after its central point has already landed. A similar issue affects the action. The best sequences express Peter's internal instability through disrupted movement. His body responds in ways he does not fully expect, turning familiar superhero ability into a source of uncertainty. These moments advance character, theme, and spectacle at the same time. Other passages appear designed mainly to increase physical scale. More vehicles, impacts, locations, and participants enter the sequence, but Peter's emotional condition remains unchanged from the beginning of the action to the end. The distinction matters because the movie's strongest conflict is not based on whether Peter can survive a larger collision. It is based on whether he can continue trusting himself. Once that uncertainty has been established, every additional beat should deepen it. Peter might hesitate at the wrong moment, use more force than intended, misread a person under outside influence, or recognize that someone else has noticed his instability. Without a new consequence, extended action becomes volume rather than escalation. The strongest defense of this scale is that Peter's crisis cannot remain private. Spider-Man protects a crowded city, and any loss of control naturally produces public consequences. The film needs enough physical danger to show why his transformation cannot be treated as a personal inconvenience. Large sequences also provide contrast with the quiet emotional passages, preserving the energy expected from a Spider-Man adventure. That defense is convincing up to a point. The action is not unnecessary, and reducing the film to conversations about loneliness would ignore the physical language through which Spider-Man stories express responsibility. The limitation lies in emphasis. When the spectacle is built from Peter's changing relationship with his power, it strengthens the movie. When scale seems included because the final act of a major superhero production must become larger, it temporarily weakens the specificity that makes this chapter distinctive. A smaller limitation appears in the treatment of the transformation itself. The physical evolution is one of the film's most promising ideas because it gives Peter's emotional imbalance a visible consequence. It suggests that he cannot divide heroism from humanity indefinitely. Yet the movie sometimes approaches the change as a mystery to be withheld rather than an experience to be explored. Mystery creates anticipation, but withholding can reduce emotional access. Peter notices symptoms, conceals them, and continues moving. This is consistent with his character, yet the audience occasionally needs more than evidence that something is wrong. We need to understand how the change alters his relationship with ordinary sensation, trust, and fear. The most affecting moments are not those that make the transformation look powerful. They are those that make Peter unsure whether his own body remains a place in which he can feel safe. The defense is that uncertainty places the audience beside him. Explaining the transformation too quickly would remove the anxiety of discovering it through consequences. It could also reduce an unsettling physical problem to another piece of superhero terminology. By delaying certainty, the film preserves the sense that Peter's identity is changing faster than his ability to describe it. Even so, concealment occasionally becomes repetition. Peter experiences an irregularity, dismisses it, and returns to action. The pattern accurately represents avoidance, but repeating it without a new emotional response risks making avoidance predictable. A more concentrated progression would allow each symptom to remove a different layer of control. The first could create private doubt, the second could damage trust, and the third could force public recognition. The film sometimes reaches those stages less cleanly than its central idea deserves. The emotional material involving MJ faces a related danger. Their scenes are strongest when they respect the imbalance between Peter's memory and her present life. He cannot treat their former relationship as a contract she unknowingly remains bound to. The film understands that affection does not remove her agency. At times, however, the story depends so heavily on the audience's existing attachment to Peter and MJ that it allows shared history to perform work the current film has not fully dramatized. A look, pause, or familiar rhythm carries enormous emotional weight because viewers remember earlier chapters. That continuity is legitimate, but the new story is most powerful when it also shows who these people are now. Nostalgia should complicate the present rather than replace it. None of these weaknesses is destructive. They emerge from the same ambition that gives the film its appeal. Brand New Day wants to be an intimate study of identity without surrendering the scale, humor, connections, and momentum of a major Spider-Man film. Its friction comes from trying to protect both purposes. The film succeeds whenever franchise elements become instruments of Peter's crisis. It weakens whenever Peter's crisis pauses so the larger franchise can display itself. The difference can be felt immediately. In one mode, every character, joke, fight, and visual effect pushes Peter toward an unavoidable choice. In the other, the movie briefly resembles a collection of expected attractions. That inconsistency keeps Brand New Day from achieving the complete concentration of its best passages. It does not invalidate the story's deeper reading. Instead, it reveals the difficult position of a film attempting to argue that Peter must become a whole person while existing inside a cinematic universe that continually asks him to become one useful part of something larger. To understand where Spider-Man. Brand New Day sits within the larger Spider-Man tradition, it helps to notice what the film chooses not to treat as a fresh beginning. Peter does not receive a new city, a new identity, or freedom from the consequences of the earlier films. He remains in New York, carries memories nobody else shares, and continues acting from the moral lessons that have defined him for years. The reset removes his support system without removing his history. That makes this chapter different from a conventional superhero origin story. An origin usually follows a person discovering power and learning responsibility. Peter has already learned both lessons repeatedly. His problem is that he may have followed responsibility to an unhealthy extreme. The film asks what comes after the hero accepts sacrifice when the dramatic decision has hardened into a daily lifestyle. Earlier live-action Spider-Man films often balanced heroism against an ordinary life Peter was actively trying to preserve. School, work, friendship, family, and romance created competing demands. The mask interrupted Peter Parker's plans, but those plans still existed. Brand New Day begins from a more severe position. Peter has reduced the conflict by allowing Spider-Man to consume nearly everything else. That difference gives the film a place within a long-running argument about the character. Spider-Man has always been defined by limitation as much as power. He can save a stranger and still disappoint someone waiting for him. He can move effortlessly above the city while struggling with money, trust, time, and guilt below it. His appeal comes from the fact that responsibility never becomes convenient. This film pushes that principle inward. Peter's greatest limitation is no longer simply that he cannot be everywhere at once. It is that he has attempted to solve the conflict by becoming almost nothing except Spider-Man. The apparent maturity of that decision conceals a failure to imagine responsibility as something that can include his own well-being. The 4-year gap after No Way Home matters because it prevents loneliness from feeling like a temporary reaction. Peter has had time to establish habits, build routines, and become highly capable inside his isolation. He is not waiting helplessly for his previous life to return. He has constructed another one. The difficulty is that this new life works operationally while failing emotionally. That places Brand New Day closer to stories about burnout and identity than to a simple tale of recovery. Peter is productive, disciplined, and constantly useful. Those qualities would normally signal progress. Here, they also conceal the disappearance of everything not connected to duty. The film reflects a recognizable modern pressure, the belief that exhaustion becomes acceptable when it can be described as commitment. The physical evolution adds an unusual form of body anxiety to that theme. Spider-Man stories have previously used transformation to explore adolescence, desire, confidence, and fear. This chapter shifts the metaphor toward adulthood. Peter's body is no longer revealing powers that open a new future. It is reacting to years of emotional and physical strain, suggesting that even heroic discipline has limits. That gives the movie a slightly unsettling relationship with the superhero power fantasy. Increased ability is not automatically presented as progress. A new response can make Peter stronger while reducing his confidence that the strength belongs to him. The film therefore treats power as something whose value depends upon control, identity, and moral context. Within the wider Marvel universe, this emphasis also functions as a retreat from constant multiversal escalation. No Way Home used collapsing realities, returning villains, and alternate Spider-Men to transform Peter's personal crisis into a large crossover event. Brand New Day inherits the consequences while redirecting attention toward one Peter's life in one city. The film is not completely free from franchise machinery. Bruce Banner, Frank Castle, and other familiar figures connect Peter to a wider world. Their presence can create the impression that even an isolated Spider-Man story must continue serving a larger network of characters. Yet the most useful appearances are those that bring the scale back toward Peter. Banner turns bodily change into a question of identity. Castle turns violence into a test of moral boundaries. Their value depends less on recognition than on the pressure they apply. Destin Daniel Cretton's arrival as director also marks a change in emphasis without rejecting the previous trilogy. Jon Watts shaped Holland's earlier films around youthful speed, social embarrassment, mentorship, and the expanding complications of the Marvel Universe. Cretton inherits an older Peter whose defining problem is no longer gaining entry to a larger heroic world. Peter has already entered it, survived it, and lost the people who made that world emotionally manageable. The direction consequently treats maturity as reduction rather than automatic wisdom. Peter has more experience, but experience has not made him emotionally complete. He is better at responding to danger and worse at allowing another person to understand him. The film rejects the idea that suffering naturally produces growth. Pain can create insight, but it can also produce habits that resemble strength while preventing change. Its relationship to the wider superhero genre is equally significant. Modern franchise films often promise that every ending leads to a larger beginning. Loss establishes the next adventure, a new character opens another storyline, and closure remains temporary. Brand New Day uses that expectation against Peter. He has entered a new chapter, but the film keeps asking whether a change in circumstances means anything when the character preserves the same emotional wound. The early critical response reflects the tension inside the movie itself. Some readings have emphasized its emotional maturity, loneliness, performances, and more intimate focus. Others have argued that familiar Marvel rhythms, crowded connections, and extended action prevent the film from becoming as distinctive as its central idea promises. Both reactions identify something real. The movie wants to move inward while remaining part of an enormous outward-moving franchise. That conflict does not make its emotional argument irrelevant. It may actually explain why the argument belongs in this particular series. Peter Parker is a character repeatedly asked to connect private pain with public obligation. The larger the surrounding universe becomes, the easier it is for Peter himself to disappear behind the function he serves within it. Brand New Day returns the wider conversation to a fundamental Spider-Man question. Responsibility is necessary, but what keeps responsibility from becoming punishment? Peter has learned how to sacrifice for others. His next stage of growth may depend on learning that preserving a human life includes preserving his own. The film's place in Spider-Man history will therefore depend less on how many future stories it launches than on whether its central change lasts. A new costume, threat, director, and chapter can signal renewal. The deeper renewal would be Peter accepting that an ordinary identity is not an obstacle standing between him and heroism. It is the part of him that gives heroism a reason to remain humane, the most revealing production fact behind Spider-Man. Brand New Day is that its change of direction did not require abandoning the writers who carried Peter through the previous chapters. Chris McKenna and Eric Sommers received the screenplay credit after also writing Far From Home and No Way Home. That continuity matters because the film's reset is built upon consequences rather than a replacement of history. The writers already understood the emotional promises surrounding Peter, MJ, Ned, and the final spell. Their task was not to manufacture another loss, but to examine the adult life created by the loss they had already written. The project also gained an unusually valuable development period through a scheduling change. Tom Holland later explained that delaying production gave Destin Daniel Cretton roughly 6 months to develop the screenplay with the creative team. A delay is not proof of quality, and additional time does not automatically produce a focused movie. In this case, however, the fact sharpens the reading of the finished structure. Brand New Day does not behave like a story rushing to reverse the previous ending. It spends significant attention establishing Peter's isolated routine and allowing that routine to become the cause of the new crisis. Cretton publicly described the team as concentrating on the suit, Spider-Man's movement, the scale of the event, and the emotional story. Those priorities can be seen working together in the film's strongest passages. The suit restores a clear, recognizable Spider-Man image, but the person inside it is less stable. The swinging offers physical freedom while Peter's private existence remains confined. The event-scale action attracts the audience outward, while the emotional design keeps returning to the cost of devoting an entire identity to the mask. That connection is important because a new costume or movement style could easily function as promotional novelty. Here, they help communicate the central contradiction. Spider-Man looks renewed before Peter has genuinely renewed his life. The visual confidence of the hero, therefore, arrives ahead of the emotional confidence of the person. Cretton's stated interest in both movement and feeling helps explain why the movie repeatedly allows a successful physical action to end with a private moment of uncertainty. Production began with substantial location filming in Glasgow, where parts of the city were used for New York streets. Official behind-the-scenes material highlighted an opening action sequence, filmed outside rather than constructing the entire passage through enclosed stages and digital environments. Location filming does not make an action scene automatically authentic, especially in a production that still relies heavily on stunt teams and visual effects. It does, however, provide real surfaces, distances, weather, architecture, and public space for those departments to build upon. That choice changes how the opening can be read. Peter's new status is grounded in the streets he has chosen to protect full-time. Vehicles occupy measurable space, buildings produce real visual boundaries, and the action must respond to the shape of an existing environment. The city feels less like an abstract background behind Spider-Man and more like a physical system through which he must make decisions. This supports the film's move away from multiversal spectacle toward pressure located in one recognizable urban world. The production also paused for approximately 1 week after Holland sustained a concussion while filming. Reports stated that the pause was taken as a precaution and that production resumed without changing the planned release date. The incident should not be romanticized as evidence of dedication, and an actor's injury does not make the resulting action more valuable. Its useful production meaning is narrower. The film's physical work involved coordinated performance demanding enough that safety had to take priority over schedule. That distinction matters when assessing the action. Holland's physical presence, stunt performers, practical vehicles, location work, editing, and digital effects contribute collectively. Treating one performer's risk as the source of realism would erase the specialists responsible for designing and safely completing the sequences. The better reading is that the production aimed to preserve a human physical reference within a highly constructed superhero world. These receipts reveal a film designed between continuity and reinvention. Returning writers protected the consequences of the earlier story. Additional development time allowed the new director to shape a different stage of Peter's life. Cretton's focus connected emotion with the suit and movement. Location photography gave the city physical weight, while the temporary production pause reminds us that spectacle is created by real people working within necessary limits. None of these facts can prove that every creative decision succeeds. They do clarify the intention behind the strongest ones. Brand New Day was not built merely to place Spider-Man back on screen. Its production choices were directed toward making his return look physically renewed while allowing the story to question whether Peter Parker has renewed at all, the strongest counter-reading of Spider-Man. Brand New Day begins by resisting the idea that Peter Parker's isolation must be understood primarily as emotional avoidance. Perhaps he has not erased himself because he is afraid to live. Perhaps he has accepted, with unusual seriousness, that returning to MJ and Ned would place his desires above the safety and independence their new lives have given them. From this perspective, Peter's distance is not evidence that he has stopped respecting himself. It is evidence that he has finally stopped treating love as a reason to pull other people into his battles. He remembers the dangers attached to knowing Spider-Man, while MJ and Ned have been released from that burden. Reintroducing himself would not simply restore friendship. It would reopen a history they did not choose to recover and potentially reconnect them to risks they can no longer evaluate from the same position. The loneliness that follows is painful, but pain does not automatically make the decision unhealthy. Responsibility often requires accepting a cost without expecting the world to reward or even recognize it. Peter's life as a full-time Spider-Man can therefore be read as a disciplined response to a reality he cannot reverse fairly. He has lost his old support system, but rather than allowing that loss to make him bitter, he continues protecting people who do not know what he surrendered for them. This interpretation also changes the meaning of his nearly empty private life. The apartment, the constant patrols, and the absence of ordinary relationships may suggest self-erasure, but they may also represent a period of deliberate reconstruction. Peter is no longer a student moving between identities created by family, school, mentors, and friends. For the first time, he must discover who he is without those structures. The fact that his new life remains incomplete does not prove that the choice behind it was mistaken. His devotion to Spider-Man might even be the most honest identity available to him. Peter Parker's public history has effectively disappeared, while Spider-Man's responsibility remains. The city still contains people in danger. His abilities still create an obligation he cannot ignore. Under these conditions, focusing on heroism is not necessarily an escape from reality. It may be the clearest way he can participate in it. The physical evolution can also support this alternative. Our central reading has treated the change as the body's protest against an unsustainable life. Yet transformation does not always represent breakdown. In superhero storytelling, it can also represent adaptation. Peter is facing greater pressure, and his powers may be changing because the person carrying them has entered a new stage of adulthood and responsibility. That possibility gives the title a more hopeful meaning. The Brand New Day may not require Peter to recover the exact life he lost. It may require him to become capable of living without it. His altered abilities could symbolize the painful emergence of a Spider-Man no longer defined by mentorship, adolescent uncertainty, or dependence upon a familiar group. What appears frightening at first may be the beginning of a form he has not yet learned to understand. The unseen villain strengthens this interpretation by making Peter's independence practically valuable. He faces a threat that cannot be approached through ordinary assumptions about visibility or direct confrontation. A hero attached too closely to predictable routines and relationships might expose those connections to manipulation. Peter's anonymity gives the enemy fewer obvious routes into his private life. What looks emotionally isolating may also provide strategic protection. Even his hesitation around MJ can be defended as respect rather than fear. Peter holds knowledge that gives him an enormous emotional advantage. He remembers intimacy she does not consciously share, entering her life and revealing that history could place an unfair obligation upon her to respond to feelings belonging to a version of herself she cannot fully access. By remaining cautious, Peter allows her present identity to matter more than his memory. This counterreading explains why the film does not simply condemn his sacrifice. Peter's decision remains rooted in compassion. He is not punishing MJ or Ned, and he does not demand recognition from the city. He continues acting according to values that survived even when his social identity did not. His loneliness may be tragic, but tragedy and error are not the same thing. The alternative becomes less convincing, however, when independence turns into secrecy about risks that affect other people. Peter has the right to accept personal loneliness. He does not have the same right to conceal an unstable transformation if it could compromise his judgment or endanger those around him. Responsibility cannot mean privately deciding that every consequence belongs to him when his power makes those consequences public. The same limit applies to MJ and Ned. Respecting their independence does not necessarily require permanent silence. Peter must not treat past love as ownership, but refusing to provide any truth also removes their ability to make an informed choice. Protection becomes paternalistic when one person decides, without discussion, which risks another person is permitted to understand. Both readings therefore explain important parts of Peter. The self-erasure interpretation explains why his life has narrowed, why constant usefulness cannot resolve his grief, and why his transformation feels connected to suppressed pressure. The disciplined sacrifice interpretation explains why his distance retains moral dignity and why returning to the past cannot be treated as an uncomplicated cure. Neither reading is sufficient alone. Calling Peter's choice purely unhealthy would diminish the courage and compassion behind it. Calling it purely heroic would ignore the damage created when sacrifice becomes permanent identity. The film's credibility comes from allowing the same behavior to contain duty and avoidance at once. My reasoned position falls between those extremes. Peter was right to accept the original cost when the crisis demanded it, and he is right not to force himself back into lives that continued without him. Where he goes wrong is in treating one necessary sacrifice as proof that every future connection must also be surrendered. His commitment becomes self-erasure not because he chooses Spider-Man, but because he refuses to let Peter Parker participate in that choice. A mature new beginning would not restore the past exactly as it was or abandon the responsibility of the mask. It would allow Peter to respect other people's agency, disclose the truths that affect them, and accept that interdependence is not the opposite of heroism. The alternative reading makes the central argument stronger by reminding us that isolation can sometimes protect, discipline can sometimes heal, and transformation can sometimes signal growth. The unresolved question is where those possibilities end and denial begins. The film's repeated visual and behavioral patterns offer clues, especially in details that appear ordinary before their full significance becomes visible. The most revealing rewatch signal in Spider-Man: Brand New Day is the way Peter repeatedly experiences other people through screens, windows, recordings, and physical distance. At first, these images seem like practical reminders of the life he lost. Look again, and they establish a larger pattern. Peter can observe connection without participating in it. Technology keeps the people he loves visible while protecting him from the uncertainty of being seen by them. The early footage of MJ and Ned continuing their lives is especially important. Peter watches moments that prove they are moving forward, but the image cannot acknowledge him in return. He possesses access without relationship. The screen offers information while preserving the emotional arrangement he has chosen. He can remain close enough to care and distant enough to avoid changing anything. That pattern subtly repeats whenever Peter pauses at the edge of another person's space. Doorways, windows, rooftops, and the borders of crowded rooms often place him near ordinary life without fully placing him inside it. On a first viewing, these compositions communicate loneliness. On a second, they reveal how frequently Peter chooses the observational position even when a path toward contact exists. His body often makes the choice before his words do. Around MJ, he may begin to lean forward, soften, or respond with the rhythm of their forgotten familiarity. Then restraint returns. The movement stops, the distance is restored, and Peter retreats behind careful language. These interrupted gestures matter because they show that his isolation is no longer effortless. One part of him is continually moving toward connection, while another part pulls him back. The film's use of webbing develops a parallel pattern. Webs normally represent Spider-Man's ability to move, rescue, and connect one point of the city to another. They turn falling into direction and distance into possibility. As Peter's physical evolution intensifies, however, webbing begins to feel less like a tool he controls and more like evidence of a process happening through him. The image of Peter waking surrounded by webbing initially plays as a disturbing symptom. Viewed within the film's wider design, it reverses the meaning of his most familiar power. The material that usually carries him into the world has formed an enclosure around him. Connection has become containment. The image quietly summarizes his life. Peter has built everything around Spider-Man, only to find himself trapped inside the identity that once gave him freedom. Watch how often the film places confidence before interruption. Peter begins a swing, rescue, joke, or physical response with the ease of an experienced hero. A small irregularity then enters the rhythm. His movement exceeds expectation, sensation arrives unexpectedly, or his expression briefly shows that the result did not belong entirely to conscious intention. These moments can be missed because Peter often completes the task successfully. The danger is hidden beneath competence. On a rewatch, the important detail is not whether he falls or loses a fight. It is the fraction of a second in which he studies his own body afterward. Each pause is another stage in the gradual loss of certainty. His humor also changes meaning when heard twice. Spider-Man's jokes still create energy and distract opponents, but some arrive precisely when Peter is least comfortable. The line provides a familiar surface while his posture or timing reveals strain beneath it. Humor becomes another mask, allowing him to sound like the hero everyone recognizes while concealing that he no longer completely recognizes himself. Flowers form a quieter signal. Peter's visit to Aunt May's grave appears to be a private act of remembrance, separate from the main threat. Yet the flowers connect grief with repetition. They are living things cut from their roots, preserved briefly so they can carry meaning to someone absent. Peter's own life follows a similar structure. He keeps his memories alive through ritual while remaining separated from the relationships that once gave those memories a living context. The grave visit also clarifies why responsibility has become so difficult for him to question. Spider-Man is tied to May's moral legacy. Reducing his patrols or asking what Peter needs may feel, to him, like weakening the promise created by her loss. On a second viewing, his devotion is therefore not only about protecting the city, it is also about maintaining a relationship with someone he can no longer speak to. Ned's fascination with Spider-Man provides a more playful version of the same theme. His tracking technology turns the hero into a moving symbol on a map. Ned can follow Spider-Man's location without recognizing the person he once knew beneath the mask. The joke carries an emotional irony Peter cannot share. His former best friend is searching for him while lacking the memory necessary to realize he has already found him. The tracker also reduces Spider-Man to visible movement. A location changes, an emergency appears, and the icon continues. It cannot show what happens when Peter returns to an empty room or hesitates outside MJ's life. The city sees a constantly active hero, while the film asks us to notice the private stillness hidden between those points. The unseen antagonist makes these patterns more threatening. Throughout the film, attention often arrives before a visible source. A person looks toward empty space, behavior changes without an obvious cause, or the camera leaves part of the frame suspiciously open. The absence is not empty, it contains pressure. On a first viewing, these details build mystery. On a second, they encourage us to question every moment in which intention and action seem slightly misaligned. A delayed reaction, an unusual eye line, or a change in posture may carry more information than the apparent center of the scene. The film hides its threat not by removing all evidence, but by distributing evidence across other people's bodies. Peter's story uses the same technique. His pain is rarely announced directly. It appears through routines, interrupted gestures, screens watched alone, jokes delivered too quickly, and spaces designed for departure rather than belonging. The film hides Peter Parker in plain sight, even while Spider-Man occupies the center of the image. These signals suggest that Brand New Day rewards a second viewing through design rather than surprise alone. The most important clues are not secret names or isolated references. They are repeated forms of distance, enclosure, observation, and interrupted control. Their full meaning depends on the revelations still ahead, but the pattern is already visible. The film keeps turning Spider-Man's tools of connection into evidence of how completely Peter has separated himself from the world. From this point on, the ending, the reveals, and their meaning are all on the table. If you want the film unspoiled, pause here and come back after you've seen it. The decisive turn begins when the invisible threat finally stops being an abstraction. The person moving through other minds is Jean Grey, a young telepath whose attacks have made her appear to be the film's central villain. That impression is strengthened by the cruelty of her most personal deception. She enters MJ's mind and uses Peter's longing against him, briefly allowing him to believe that the relationship erased from the world has somehow returned. The event hurts because it does more than trick Peter. It exposes the fantasy hidden beneath his restraint. He has spent years telling himself that staying away from MJ is the responsible choice, yet part of him still waits for a single sign that will remove the need to choose. Jean gives him that sign in the most convincing form possible, then reveals that it was never MJ's choice. Peter is forced to confront how desperately he wants memory to solve a problem that memory alone cannot solve. This is also the moment when Jean and Peter become true mirrors. Jean can enter other identities because her own has been shaped by fear, pursuit, and the loss of her sister, Sarah. Peter hides inside Spider-Man because Peter Parker's life has become defined by absence. One character survives by occupying other people. The other survives by allowing a public symbol to occupy nearly all of himself. Both are powerful, isolated, and increasingly uncertain about where the person ends and the ability begins. Peter initially responds by doing what he has done throughout the film. He tries to contain the problem. Working from the information he has received from damage control, he helps capture Jean and develops technology intended to suppress her powers. The decision is understandable. Jean has manipulated innocent people, endangered the city, and violated MJ's autonomy. Peter cannot ignore those consequences simply because he recognizes her pain. Yet containment becomes the first major moral failure of his investigation. Peter trusts the institution that presents itself as the stable authority because its explanation fits the evidence he can see. Jean appears unpredictable, damage control appears organized. Bill Metzger speaks the language of public protection, while Jean communicates through intrusion and chaos. Peter therefore mistakes order for honesty. The film's deeper point is not that institutions are always corrupt or that unstable power must never be restrained. It is that Peter accepts Metzger's version because he is still trying to solve uncertainty without relationship. He wants a clean division between protector and threat. Jean's behavior makes that division easy to believe. What he has not yet asked is why she is searching for the same fragment of language again and again, or why damage control knows more about her abilities than it admits. The clue is the incomplete phrase Jean received from Sarah before her death. She has been searching for VMAX, assuming it names a project, device, or location. The answer is smaller and more devastating. Inside the damage control facility, Jean sees a worn label on an air vent. Most of the printed word has faded, leaving only the fragment she received. Sarah was not sending a secret code. She was transmitting the final thing she could see. That revelation reorders the story. The mysterious phrase was never a map toward power. It was evidence of confinement. Jean's violent search was not driven by a desire to dominate the city. It was an attempt to reconstruct the final experience of a sister taken from her. Damage control had detained Sarah, forced her abilities beyond safe limits, and treated her mind as a resource to be measured. Metzger's organization did not merely fail to protect someone dangerous. It created the danger by reducing a person to what could be extracted from her. The consequence is Jean's psychological collapse. Her powers surge outward, freezing the city's movement and turning private grief into a public emergency. The scale is enormous, but the emotional cause is precise. Jean is standing in the place where her sister's identity was erased by an institution that described exploitation as safety. Her reaction is destructive, yet the film refuses to make destruction the only truth about her. This is where Peter's own transformation reaches its decisive test. He enters the facility wearing the inhibitor he has built to regulate his changing body. The device represents his preferred solution to identity: separate the unstable part, suppress it, and continue functioning. It allows him to use his mechanical web shooters and preserve the version of Spider-Man he already understands. Damage Control has prepared for that version. Its security forces possess equipment designed to neutralize the artificial webs. Peter's familiar methods fail because the institution has studied the visible hero while ignoring the changing person. The trap works on the Spider-Man Peter has been trying to preserve, not on the integrated identity he has been afraid to accept. As the fight turns against him, the physical symptoms he has hidden become impossible to disguise. His body is no longer politely waiting for his emotional life to stabilize. The darkened eyes, organic webbing, heightened senses, and increased force reveal that his evolution has continued beneath every attempt at suppression. Peter appears closest to becoming the monster he fears at the exact moment the film asks whether greater power has removed his moral agency. Jean frames the choice in terms Peter cannot avoid. She believes people like them are denied ordinary lives. Difference attracts fear, control, exploitation, and loss. From her perspective, Peter's hope of remaining both a human being and a hero is another comforting lie. The world has already taken his family, his friendships, his name, and his future with MJ. Why continue pretending that Peter Parker survives in any meaningful sense? The argument is persuasive because the film has spent its entire runtime showing evidence for it. Peter lives alone. The people he loves do not remember him. The city values Spider-Man without knowing the person beneath the mask. Even his body is moving away from ordinary human experience. Jean is not inventing his fear. She is naming the conclusion toward which his life appears to be moving. Peter's answer is expressed through action rather than a simple declaration. He removes the inhibitor and accepts that the transformation belongs to him. He does not become less dangerous by doing so. He becomes more powerful at the exact moment restraint matters most. The security forces attacking him are trapped and disabled rather than destroyed. His organic webbing bypasses the countermeasures designed for his old equipment, but the scene's victory is not that his powers have upgraded. It is that his control no longer depends entirely upon denying what he has become. This resolves the physical thread established throughout the film. Peter's evolution was never simply punishment for isolation, nor was it automatically a gift. It became dangerous because he treated it as an alien force to be hidden. Once he accepts that Spider-Man and Peter Parker are not rival occupants of one body, he can use the new abilities without surrendering moral authorship. The distinction is crucial. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse. Peter's strength remains heroic because he directs it through values formed by grief, love, and experience. The body may change, but responsibility still requires choice. The film's argument is not that authenticity means acting without restraint. It means restraint becomes healthier when it is chosen by a whole person rather than imposed by one identity upon another. Peter then reaches Jean before she can turn her grief into irreversible revenge against Metzger. He does not excuse what she has done. He also refuses the institution's claim that she is only a threat. His appeal focuses on consequence. Killing the man responsible would not restore Sarah or return the life stolen from Jean. It would allow Metzger's cruelty to determine the person she becomes after surviving it. Jean responds by entering Peter's mind. Earlier, psychic entry was framed as violation and manipulation. Here, Peter allows it, changing the meaning of the same power. Consent turns invasion into connection. Jean encounters the memory of Aunt May, not as a convenient speech from the past, but as the emotional structure that still exists inside Peter even after the world has forgotten him. May's presence links Jean's grief to Peter's. Both have lost the person who gave moral shape to their lives. Both respond by building an identity around the loss. Jean turns pain outward through psychic control. Peter turns it inward through endless duty. The memory offers a third possibility, being valued not for exceptional power, usefulness, or difference, but simply as a person. This is the answer Jean has been denied by damage control. Metzger's system sees extraordinary people as assets, hazards, or resources. Their humanity matters only in relation to what their abilities can provide or threaten. Peter has unknowingly applied a similar logic to himself. He values Peter Parker mainly as the moral support system required to keep Spider-Man operational. May's memory breaks that calculation. Peter was loved before usefulness entered the equation. Peter extends that recognition to Jean. He does not promise to repair her life or replace her sister. He offers the one thing neither of them has allowed themselves to seek honestly, another person willing to remain present. The moment completes the film's central movement from observation to relationship. Peter stops studying Jean as a problem and allows her to see the grief beneath his mask. The connection is immediately tested. Frank Castle arrives prepared to stop Jean permanently. A shot intended for her becomes the final measure of Peter's choice. His danger sense warns him, and he moves Jean out of its path, taking the injury himself. The action is familiar for Spider-Man. He places his body between another person and harm. Its meaning is different because Jean has spent much of the film manipulating him and threatening the people he loves. Peter does not save her because she has become harmless or because her pain erases accountability. He saves her because his moral code cannot depend on whether the person in danger has already earned his affection. The consequence is severe. Peter collapses, and the city receives the possibility that Spider-Man may not survive. Frank, who has challenged Peter's restraint throughout the story, is forced to confront the human cost of his own certainty. The man who believed permanent force produced cleaner outcomes has nearly killed the hero who was trying to prevent another death. Frank's response matters because the film does not transform him into Peter's moral opposite and leave him unchanged. He carries Peter to medical care and remains present. Later, his respect is directed not toward Spider-Man's strength, but toward the courage of protecting someone at the moment when fear made destruction easier. The experience does not erase Frank's history or philosophy, but it briefly allows him to recognize that restraint can demand more bravery than force. Jean also chooses connection over escape. Though she remains outside the hospital, she uses her abilities to reach Peter's unconscious mind and help keep him alive. The person first presented as a body-hopping threat now enters another mind to preserve rather than control it. The reversal is direct without being simplistic. Her power has not changed. The relationship governing its use has. Peter wakes to a city transformed by concern. Vigils gather. Red and blue light turns the skyline into a public expression of gratitude. People wear Spider-Man masks and wait for evidence that the hero survived. The sequence could be read as sentimental reward, but its placement gives it greater significance. Peter believed the city needed his constant labor, while Peter Parker needed nothing. The crowd reveals that the relationship was never entirely one-directional. They still do not know his civilian identity, but they recognize dependence. Spider-Man has carried the city repeatedly, and now the city gathers around the possibility of losing him. Peter does not receive his old life back. He receives evidence that allowing others to care is not the same as burdening them. Frank helps him leave without exposing his identity, creating a small visual reversal. While Peter exits as an ordinary person, Frank appears at the hospital window in the mask so the crowd can celebrate Spider-Man. Earlier, the mask allowed Peter to disappear. Here, it protects Peter Parker's return to the world. The symbol no longer consumes the man, it creates space for him. Metzger's escape prevents the resolution from becoming too clean. The individual responsible for Sarah's death and Jean's persecution avoids immediate accountability. That choice can feel frustrating, but it preserves the film's distinction between emotional victory and institutional victory. Peter saves Jean from becoming an instrument of Metzger's violence, yet the system that produced the crisis remains active. Yelena Belova's effort to examine damage control's concealed files suggests that accountability may continue through evidence rather than revenge. It also confirms that Peter's new commitment to interdependence cannot remain a private emotional lesson. Corrupt power is harder to confront when every hero, witness, and victim operates alone. The unfinished investigation extends the theme beyond friendship into collective action. Jean's departure carries similar ambiguity. She leaves New York by bus, moving toward an uncertain destination rather than being absorbed immediately into Peter's life. The film respects the connection without pretending one compassionate exchange can resolve trauma, grief, or public danger. Peter offers a beginning, not ownership. Jean's future remains hers to choose. MJ's ending is quieter and deliberately incomplete. Peter does not use Jean's deception or the crisis as an excuse to force the entire truth upon her. The earlier kiss is revealed to have occurred while MJ was controlled, making Peter's emotional relief painfully false and the violation of her autonomy more serious. Afterward, her lack of memory provides the logical clue that exposes Metzger's lie, but it also reasserts that the relationship cannot be restored through a shortcut. The film leaves MJ alone with an object from the erased past and with a feeling she cannot fully name. This can be read as evidence that affection survives beneath the spell. It can also be read more cautiously as the persistence of emotional traces without complete memory. The distinction matters. The ending does not grant Peter the romantic reunion he wants. It gives both characters the possibility of future recognition without declaring that love automatically defeats consent, time, or change. Peter's final return to Aunt May's grave completes the inner arc. Earlier visits reinforced a life organized around solitary duty. Now he acknowledges that continuing alone is no longer the responsible choice. May's lesson has not changed. Peter's interpretation of it has. Responsibility does not require him to become unreachable. The last encounter with Ned turns that realization into a simple human action. Peter meets him again and introduces himself rather than remaining a silent observer. Their familiar handshake emerges almost automatically. Ned's body remembers a rhythm his conscious mind cannot explain, and recognition appears in the name he speaks. The moment works because it avoids a large magical reversal. Peter does not deliver a perfect speech, and Ned does not suddenly recover every shared memory on screen. Connection begins through habit, trust, and movement. The handshake is the opposite of psychic possession. Jean entered bodies and used them without consent. Peter reaches out, and Ned freely completes the pattern. This final image answers the deep view question with necessary qualification. Peter's devotion to Spider-Man is heroic when it protects people without demanding reward. It becomes self-erasure when he assumes that love, friendship, and assistance are threats to responsibility. The film does not solve the conflict by asking him to choose Peter Parker over Spider-Man. It lets him become both at the same time. There is another defensible reading. Ned's recognition could suggest that the spell is weakening and that the old life will gradually return regardless of Peter's growth. Under that interpretation, the ending risks rewarding him with restoration rather than requiring him to build something new. The post-credits image, which places his tracker unexpectedly beyond Earth, also threatens to pull this intimate resolution back toward larger franchise machinery. Yet the more persuasive reading focuses on Peter's action before the recognition. He introduces himself without knowing whether Ned will remember. That is the growth. The handshake is not valuable merely because it may break magic. It is valuable because Peter finally accepts the uncertainty of reaching toward another person. The post-credits suggestion of an off-world future may shape the next adventure, but it does not alter the emotional conclusion of this one. Before Peter can be carried into another cosmic crisis, Brand New Day restores the principle that makes any scale of heroism meaningful. He cannot protect humanity by treating his own humanity as disposable. The movie earns its ending not through the defeat of a single villain, because Metzger escapes, nor through complete romantic repair, because MJ's future remains uncertain. It earns it by changing Peter's definition of responsibility. He begins the film believing that sacrifice proves love when nobody else is allowed to share the burden. He ends it understanding that survival, trust, and moral control depend upon connection. The Brand New Day is therefore not the morning after the world forgets Peter Parker. That was only absence. The true beginning arrives when Peter chooses to be known again without controlling what recognition will give him in return. What remains after the plot has finished is not the image of Peter winning a fight. It is the smaller sight of him choosing to be visible again. For most of the film, Spider-Man moves through New York as a figure everyone can recognize and almost nobody can truly know. Peter Parker exists in the spaces left behind by that symbol: the attic room, the graveyard, the pause before speaking to MJ, the moment after an unfamiliar power passes through his body. The ending does not erase those spaces. It changes what Peter believes they must mean. The image that stays with me is the final handshake with Ned. It is not dramatic in the way a collapsing building or a citywide psychic event is dramatic. It carries no guarantee that the missing years will return. Peter reaches out without knowing whether the gesture will be accepted, understood, or remembered. Ned answers almost by instinct, and for one brief moment the body preserves a relationship the mind cannot fully name. That is why the moment matters more than a complete restoration would have. A sudden return of every memory could have solved Peter's loneliness through magic. The handshake asks him to do something harder. He must begin again without controlling the result. He can offer truth, presence, and patience, but he cannot demand that another person become the exact version he remembers. The same principle reshapes his connection with MJ. The film refuses to treat love as a password capable of reopening a closed life. Peter's memories remain real, and the emotional traces between them may still exist, but MJ's present identity matters. She is not waiting in suspension for him to restore the correct timeline. Any future relationship must be built through choices made now, not through Peter's ownership of what happened before. That restraint gives the ending a mature sadness. Peter has not recovered everything he lost. Jean has not been healed by one act of compassion. Metzger has not been fully held accountable. Damage Control's failures have not disappeared. Frank Castle has not abandoned every belief that separates him from Peter. The city remains dangerous, and Peter's transformed body still belongs to a future he does not completely understand. Yet the film no longer treats incompleteness as proof of failure. Peter begins the story trying to become a finished solution. He wants Spider-Man to be constantly available, morally certain, physically controlled, and free from relationships that could create hesitation. That version of heroism sounds efficient because it removes every variable except duty. It also removes the conditions that make duty humane. Jean reveals the danger of identity without stable connection. Her power allows her to cross the boundaries between people, but grief and exploitation have made those crossings acts of control. Peter's answer is not to deny what she can do. He shows her that power can enter a relationship without destroying the person on the other side. The difference is consent, restraint, and the recognition that another mind is not an empty space waiting to be used. Peter needs the same lesson in reverse. He does not enter other minds, but he has tried to control other people's futures by deciding what they should know and which risks they may choose. His motives are loving. The result is still a life built around decisions no one else is allowed to share. By the end, responsibility becomes less solitary. It means protecting people while respecting their ability to respond, disagree, remain, or walk away. That is the human question the film leaves open. How much of ourselves can we sacrifice for others before sacrifice stops expressing love and begins preventing it? There is no clean universal answer. Some moments demand that a person accept a cost without negotiation. Peter's final choice in the previous story was one of those moments. The danger begins when an emergency decision becomes a permanent identity and pain becomes the only evidence that the decision mattered. After reflection, the movie grows slightly because its best ideas continue connecting after the spectacle fades. The organic webbing, the screens, the empty apartment, Jean's movement through other people, MJ's uncertain familiarity, and Ned's final gesture all return to the same conflict between connection and control. The film is not always disciplined enough to keep every franchise element inside that argument, but the argument itself is stronger than the crowded structure surrounding it. The guiding question was whether Peter's complete devotion to Spider-Man should be read as heroic commitment or as self-erasure. The answer is that it becomes both, depending on what the commitment demands. It is heroic when Peter accepts danger, uses power carefully, and protects someone even when that person has frightened or harmed him. It becomes self-erasure when he assumes that being responsible requires him to have no needs, no witnesses, and no place in the lives he protects. Peter does not finish the film by choosing one identity and defeating the other. He accepts that the hero and the person must remain accountable to each other. Spider-Man gives Peter a way to act upon his values. Peter gives Spider-Man the compassion, memory, humor, and restraint that prevent power from becoming another institution of control. Neither side is complete alone. That synthesis is what allows the title to earn some of its promise. The New Day is not clean. It arrives with injuries, unresolved threats, uncertain relationships, and consequences that cannot be reversed. It is new because Peter finally responds differently. Instead of watching from a safe distance, he introduces himself. Instead of suppressing every unfamiliar part of his body, he learns to direct it. Instead of treating help as evidence of weakness, he allows connection to preserve him. My personal score for Spider-Man, Brand New Day, is 6 out of 10. That score reflects a film with a compelling emotional center, several thoughtful visual patterns, and a more mature understanding of Peter Parker than its crowded structure consistently allows. Its greatest achievement is turning the familiar conflict between Peter and Spider-Man into a question of integration rather than scheduling. The problem is no longer that heroism makes him late for an ordinary life. It is that he has almost stopped believing an ordinary life deserves to exist. Tom Holland carries that idea with a performance built from restraint rather than constant breakdown. He communicates a Peter who has learned how to look functional while gradually losing the ability to feel whole. The humor remains recognizable, but it often sounds like a tool he reaches for under pressure. The quieter reactions after action, especially when his body surprises him or MJ unsettles his control, give the film emotional continuity. Zendaya's work is equally important because MJ cannot become a passive reward for Peter's suffering. Her uncertainty protects the story from the easiest romantic solution. The film allows Peter's memories to matter without making them more important than her autonomy. Even when the writing depends heavily on the audience's attachment to their earlier relationship, the performance keeps MJ present as a person rather than an object from Peter's past. Jean Grey gives the movie its most interesting mirror. Her grief, instability, and treatment by damage control connect the personal story to a wider fear of people whose abilities cannot be easily regulated. The film is strongest when it refuses to reduce her to either innocent victim or dangerous villain. She causes real harm, but the system hunting her has also created and exploited the conditions behind that harm. Peter's decision to protect her does not erase accountability. It prevents accountability from becoming revenge. The largest limitation is concentration. Bruce Banner, Frank Castle, damage control, MJ, Ned, Jean, Peter's transformation, and the future-facing material all contain useful ideas, but the film cannot give every thread equal depth. Some appearances sharpen Peter's crisis. Others briefly feel like reminders that this story must also prepare pieces for a larger universe. The difference is visible whenever an emotionally precise scene is followed by action that expands in scale without expanding the argument. The action remains energetic and often physically readable, but not every sequence carries the same dramatic weight. The best movement reveals Peter's changing relationship with his body. The weaker movement repeats danger after the emotional point has already been understood. This makes portions of the film feel longer than the character story requires, even when the individual images remain polished. A 6 out of 10 is therefore not a rejection of the movie's ambition. It recognizes how close the film comes to a distinctive reinvention and how often franchise obligation interrupts that focus. The central interpretation is thoughtful enough to support reflection, but the complete experience is less controlled than the hero's emotional arc deserves. Viewers most likely to value the film are those who connect with Spider-Man through Peter's loneliness, moral restraint, and ordinary vulnerability, rather than through spectacle alone. Anyone invested in the consequences of No Way Home will find meaningful development here, especially because the story does not simply restore the previous group and pretend the sacrifice never mattered. Audiences primarily looking for constant multiverse escalation, uninterrupted action, or a clean romantic reunion may find the film hesitant. Its most important victories are emotional and incomplete. The ending opens relationships rather than fully repairing them, and the villainous system remains active after the immediate crisis. That ambiguity is purposeful, but it may feel unsatisfying to viewers expecting a more decisive franchise chapter. It plays best as a selective cinema recommendation for viewers already invested in this version of Peter. The large action and urban movement benefit from a theatrical screen and full sound, yet the reason to see it is not scale by itself. The performances, pauses, visual echoes, and shifting meaning of the web imagery provide the material that lasts. Its rewatch value is moderate to good. A second viewing can reveal how often Peter is separated by screens and architecture, how his humor conceals uncertainty, and how Gene's influence is signaled through eye lines, pauses, and negative space before the story explains it. The movie rewards attention to design more than a hunt for references. Still, its structural crowding may become more noticeable once the mystery is gone. The most honest verdict is that Brand New Day understands the Spider-Man it wants Peter to become more clearly than it understands how many franchise demands should surround that transformation. It is emotionally intelligent, visually purposeful, and occasionally moving. It is also overfilled, unevenly paced, and too willing to interrupt its strongest human material with obligations that feel imported from outside the central story. Even with those limitations, the film leaves Peter in a meaningful place. He has not recovered a perfect life. He has recovered the willingness to participate in one. That is a smaller victory than saving the city, and perhaps a more difficult one for this version of the character. A mask can protect a person, give shape to responsibility, and help someone become braver than fear would otherwise allow. It becomes dangerous only when the person underneath starts believing there is nothing worth saving behind it. If this deeper look gave you a new way to read the film, you can like the video and subscribe to Cinema Deep View for more movie analysis built around the choices beneath the spectacle. How did you interpret Peter's transformation? Was it the physical result of suppressing Peter Parker, or the beginning of an evolution he would have faced regardless of his isolation? And where does Spider-Man, Brand New Day honestly sit for you? A meaningful new direction for this Peter, or an ambitious but overcrowded chapter that never fully reaches its potential? Cinema Deep View, look closer and the movie changes.